What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we're going to be going over using sliders in our settings menu, or any of our menus. So to this point, we had these sliders here that we weren't able to actually use unless we actually manually clicked on them and dragged them with the mouse, which is still a viable option. However, I would like to be able to control them with my keyboard and with my controller, that way the players can also determine what value it is, especially if they don't have a mouse plugged in, because that's just silly. They shouldn't need a mouse to adjust these components when we can easily adjust them with keyboard or controller. So you can see our entire settings menu is now controllable. These sliders still need a little bit of work visually. That way we can relay that information back to the player that they are selecting that slider currently. We may also want to display the true value of the slider to the user. We have a lot of different options of things we can do, but the first thing I want to do is get the sliders working without using the mouse so that we have full freedom on this menu. So that's what we're going to be covering today. If you'd like to get caught up in this series before we hop into this episode, then feel free to click this icon in the top right corner right here to check out every episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series. Alternatively, if you're just interested in the movable sliders on widgets using keyboard or controller, then I'll go ahead and link you to this episode right here, which is the first episode of the settings menu, and we're going to be building on top of that logic today. These episodes will be very helpful in showing you exactly how I'm doing my other logic. That way you can see how I'm doing the sliders and why I'm doing it that way. But if you have your own method for menu controls, you don't have to follow them. That is up to you. I'd like to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. Thank you guys for all the love, all the support over the years. I'm so excited to keep working on these episodes week after week, and I'm so glad you guys are enjoying, so thank you so much. With all that said, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial, but today's episode on the sliders is handled entirely in the blueprint and in our settings screen widget. So go to your settings screen widget. For me, I have it right here. And we don't have to modify anything with the event graph today. So the first thing I want to do when I come in here is actually go to my determine button to focus function. This is a function I made in my other episodes where I take the current row and the current column and determine what button we are actually on and return that. So we can do things like highlight it or change its value and display that back to the player. That way they know what button they're on. We had logic in here for the sliders, and for this determine button to focus function returns a button widget. And the sliders are the actual Unreal sliders, they are not buttons. So we could change this function to return a widget instead, and just use a standard widget type like this. Or we could make a new function. I decided to make a new function because we may have other sliders, we may have other objects, and instead of having a catch-all, if we have a separate function for them, it will work all the same. And so in determine button to focus, my first two rows are my sliders, my music volume slider and my sound effect volume slider. But nothing was hooked up or returned here. At this point, I'm actually going to just delete these values. You could add a return node and have nothing plugged into it if you'd like. That is a valid option, because then an invalid button will be returned, which will give us the same result as just not returning anything. I'd say this is the cleanest method because you can see these two rows don't return a valid button, and then we'll know to look for other object types such as our slider. Now, we want to make two new functions today. We're going to make a function that is basically determine button to focus, but I call it determine slider to focus because it's going to do the slider specific logic, and it is going to return a slider, not a button. Then we also need our actual move slider function, which is what we are going to do when the user presses the proper direction, whether they want to decrease the value or increase the value. We need to adjust that slider. We need to move the current value on it to the corresponding direction. So go ahead and make two new functions. You can do that by pressing plus function right here. And again, I have move slider and determine slider to focus. So let's go into determine slider to focus to start. And we want to add an output parameter here. And to do that, you can click on your function. So either the purple node inside of the actual function on the graph or the function in the function list. And once you do that, you have your inputs and output parameters in this detail panel. We want to add a new output parameter. I've called it current slider, and I've changed the type to a slider object reference. So determine button to focus was returning a button, but determine slider to focus is returning a slider. And now this one's really easy because in my case, I don't have any columns for the sliders. These sliders take up the entire row, so I don't have to do row and column logic like we did in determine button to focus, row and column logic. Instead, we're just doing row logic. So in determine slider to focus, I have my current row variable, which remember the row is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I haven't done this yet, but we could also add a row for these buttons as well to change tabs to go to different menus on the settings screen. And I'm going to drag off my current row and type switch on int. And I'm going to add as many values as I need. Now, I only have 2 sliders, and they are my first rows in my settings menu, so index 0 and index 1. So for me, it's super simple. I can just use 0 and 1. If you had them somewhere in the middle, say 0 was a button but 1's a slider, you can still use this method, just either skip row 0 or add a blank return node that doesn't return anything. You can see I don't have my default plugged into anything. That's because if it doesn't fall within this range, we want to return either nothing or an invalid object, and that way we'll know it is not a slider that we're checking against, so we don't want to try and return a slider reference. And now in here, it's very simple at this point. We just line up the indices with the slider that we want to return. So I have my music volume slider right here, MV slider, and I have my sound effect volume slider, SEV slider. Make sure these are both variables. And if they are, you will be able to grab them in the graph. So we are going to grab MV slider and get it, and SEV slider and get that. Now once we've gotten each of these, we just need to add a return node for each of these options. You'll probably already have one in here when you come in, so you'll only need to add one if you're doing it like I am, and then just plug in your sliders to the corresponding return nodes. So at index 0, I use my music volume slider and return that, but at index 1, I use my sound effect volume slider and return that. Essentially, whatever row the player is on, we return the corresponding slider if there is one. That's all we need to do to get determine slider to focus working. We haven't called it yet, but we will go over that in a few minutes. The next thing that we need to make is our move slider function. So if you haven't already, make a new function called move slider. And move slider, I have 2 input parameters. The input parameters are the direction, so the direction that we're moving, either left or right, and then the slider reference, so the actual slider to move. My direction variable is an integer, and my slider ref is a slider object reference. We are determining the slider that we're moving from this function, so we can simply pass the result in from determine slider to move into our move slider function, and that will do wonders for us. Once you have these parameters, you can go into the function, and here is my move slider function. So it might look a little complex, but it's actually pretty simple. We just have a few different cases that we need to account for here. So remember that we can move either left or right on a slider, but we also have a minimum and a maximum value, and we need to make sure we stay within that range. So if we were moving left, we can't fall below the minimum. If we are moving right, we can't go above the maximum. We need to keep all this in mind. The first thing we need to do is determine what direction we are moving. So I use my direction parameter that I have here and check to see if it's less than 0. Because my directions in my event graph, if I'm going left, it is -1. If I'm going right, it is 1. That is just for me. That's just a value that I use. So left is negative, right is positive. And so in here, if my direction is less than 0, that means it is a negative value, which means we are going to the left. If it is greater than 0, that means it is a positive value, and so it is going to the right. So simply drag off your direction, and you can type less than integer, and you can leave it at 0. Then you can drag off the result and put it into a branch. So if it's true, we're going to the left. If it's false, we're going to the right. So that's what we've done here. We have our slider reference in the moveSlider function, and that is what we're going to use to grab the current value as well as update it to reach the new value that we have. There's a few things we should make sure of before we do this. So the music volume and the sound effect volume. These are two sliders that just refer to volume, so typically you would use 0 to 100%, right? 0% of your volume or 100% of your volume. Sliders by default have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. You can see they both have these, and I haven't changed them. So if you want, you could change these values to be 0 to 100. For me, I'm fine to leave it as a ratio. We can easily convert that into an actual ratio of volume. So 1.0 is 100%, 0.7 would be 70%. But really, this is just preference here. It will change what your increments are, your step sizes are, when you're moving the slider, but otherwise it'll work the same regardless of what values you use. I'm going to leave them at the standard values of 0 and 1.0. And we need to know that because we need to determine how much our slider is going to move when the player presses the button to move it. So first things first, let's get the current value of the slider. If we drag off of our slider ref and type get value, we can do just that. Now, this gets the current value of the slider. Very simple. That's what we want. I have a hard-coded value of 0.05 that I am using as the step size. So essentially, whenever the player presses left or right, then it is moving 0.05. So on a scale of 0 to 1, it would take 20 button presses to go from the minimum to the maximum. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Settings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I should be directly in the middle. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I should be at the end. And that's how that works. But that is just an arbitrary value that I have assigned it. I have assigned it 0.05. There is an actual step size variable on the appearance section of the slider. So you see I'm using the 0.05 hard-coded. What we really should do is set the step size to 0.05 if that's the value I want to use. And you'll notice you can now change this for different sliders. So I could change it to 0.1 for sound effects, but 0.05 for music volume. And all we have to do to get this to work is drag off of our slider reference again, get step size. Now with this value in here, I can plug it into each of these values and we will get the same result. It's just less of a hard-coded method, and you can see that when we go into our settings, one step of the music volume is going to be less than one step of the sound effect volume. See how the sound effect volume is doubled because the step size is different. So the sound effect volume takes less steps to reach the maximum value. So there we go. Now I am going to change the sound effect volume step size back to 0.05 because I want them to be the same in this case, but that is just something I wanted to show you. Now to the actual logic. So we have our current value and we have our step size. We need to either add the step size or decrease the step size to move the slider along. Either way, we need the current value and the step size for each of these operations. So drag off your current value and do minus, which will be float minus float. Then pass in your step size as the thing being subtracted from the current value. Add another node off the get value and type plus. It'll be float plus float. And you're going to set the step size as the other parameter. In each of these operations, you're going to get a return value. And that is what we want to check to see if it is below the minimum or above the maximum. And if it is on either of those, we want to make sure that we set it to the maximum value or the minimum value instead of letting it go under the minimum or above the maximum. To determine the minimum and maximum, well, we already have that on each of these sliders. So we can drag off of our slider reference and type min value and get the min value. And we can drag off of our slider reference and type max value and get the max value. All right. Now, we need to take our results of the current value and the step size and check it against these values. So the float minus float is going to be checked against the minimum value. When we're subtracting, we're moving to the left, so we're only worried about the minimum. We want to check if the result of the value minus the step size is less than float, the minimum value. Then for the max value, remember that when we are moving to the right, we're only worried about the max value. So the value plus the step size result greater than float, the max value. All right, and that's what we have here. So now the last thing we need to do is actually get the result of these operations. I'm using a select statement for this because it makes this a little bit cleaner with how much logic we have going on here. I don't want to add more reroute nodes. So in this case, we have our value minus step size less than min value. If this is true, we want to return the minimum value. We don't want to return a value less than the minimum. If it is false, we just want to return the result of the value minus the step size. So this right here. Those of you that aren't familiar with the select node, we can go over that right now. So if you type select, you have a lot of different options, but the one we really want is just the select node. When you have your select node here, you can change your index, which will say wildcard, to a specific type. We want it to be a Boolean because we want to pass in a Boolean and then we want to pass in a value for false and true. And whatever that Boolean evaluates to, we will use the value that is passed into that corresponding parameter. So if the Boolean is checked, say it returns true, then whatever value we pass into true is what's going to come out in our return value. If the Boolean is unchecked or false, then whatever value is passed into false is what's going to come out of the return value. So for the minimum value, we want to take our result less than the minimum and pass that result into the index. Now, once we do this, we want to have a true and a false value. So regardless of what result we get, we have a value to return to the slider. If it is true that the current value is less than the minimum value, we want to pass in the minimum value. We don't want to let it go below the minimum. So we drag off of min value and pass that into the true. Now, if it is false that the current value is less than the minimum value, we just want to use the actual value that we're at. So we want to drag off of our float minus float and pass that into the false. At that point, you'll get this node I have right here. Now let's make the other select for the maximum value. Boolean. Let's pass in the Boolean from the result of the float plus float being greater than the maximum value. If it is true that this result is greater than the maximum value, we don't want to use that value. We just want to use the maximum value. We don't want to show anything above the maximum value. If it is false that the value plus the step size is greater than the max value, we just want to use the current value. We just want to use the result of this addition. Then you'll get this node right here. So now we have everything but the final two nodes here. If we drag off of our slider reference, we can call a function setValue. And this will allow us to set the current value of the slider. We're going to need two of these, one for if we're moving to the left or one if we're moving to the right. Technically, you could just do it with one node. I think this is the easiest way to understand it. That's very important in game development. We always want to make sure our information is easy to read and edit. So we are going to need two set value nodes off of the slider reference. We want the select off the minimum value to set the first value and the select off the maximum value to set the second value. So return value into in value. Now lastly, we need to hook up our branch. So remember that this is checking if the direction is less than 0. If it is less than 0, that means it is moving to the left. So the true needs to go into the set value that is coming from the minimum value logic. And the false needs to go into the set value that is coming from the maximum value logic. At this point, we can safely move our sliders. One additional thing I'd love to show you is the value right here. And under appearance, you can change that to say 0.5, and your sliders will actually start right in the center, like they're at 50%. So everything will still work as expected, but you don't have to start at 0 volume. You might even want to put it higher, like maybe you want to have it at 80% volume to start, or maybe even 100. But you have that freedom, so feel free to adjust those as you see fit. Now, once all this is in, what we need to do is update our move selection function to actually call the functions that we created in today's episode. So let's clean this up a little bit. And move selection is right here. So move selection in this screen is pretty busy. There's a lot going on. Luckily, we only need to add 4 nodes, so this will be a pretty simple change. Right now it's a little ugly. Of course, we'll clean it up as we go over it. I've gone over move selection many times throughout the series, and it's quite complicated, so I'm not going to go over it all again right now. But essentially, we check to see if this is vertical or horizontal movement. Now, we only care about sliders during horizontal movement, because yes, we can select them already with vertical movement. But right now, we care about actually adjusting the value. So we only care about calling these functions during horizontal movement. So that's the first thing. If horizontal movement is true, we go into this logic here. Now, this logic is checking to see if there are other elements that we can navigate to within this row. So basically, if there are other columns in this row. My rows are a little bit more arbitrary on this menu, but it doesn't matter how you do it. Basically, what you need to do is make sure that you either have one row marked as the slider, or you just don't have any other elements they can navigate to. And that's the option that I've chosen. So in my max selections in each row array that I have, I can open up the value, and these are all the default values. So all the rows have this many columns. The first 2 rows are the sliders, and they both have only 1 column. So when I try and move to the left or right, it's going to say, nope, you don't have any room for that, and it is going to be false. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a slider, though. You can see the bottom row here is the back button, and that is not a slider. I still want that to work. But if I press right and left on the back button, I don't want to actually navigate anywhere. So we need to determine if it is a button first, and then if it is not a button, we can check to see if it is a slider. There are many elegant ways of doing this, so feel free to change your logic to fit with your menu. For me, this is always going to be the case. I'm always going to have my sliders on an individual row. So this will work for me. But you may need to adjust yours slightly to account for all your needs. So essentially, if your movement logic, if we can't navigate to the left or the right based on the direction we've given in the row we are in, that's where we're going to do our slider logic. So if you're following the series directly, whenever I set current selection in row, the false on that branch right before that node is where we want to add our slider logic. And now that we know that, we can actually implement this logic, which again is actually quite simple. So the first thing we want to do is check to see if there is a button to focus on the current row and column that we're in. We have a function to do this called determine button to focus. We use it several times. Now, if this returns nothing, no button, we'll know that it could be another option, such as our slider, in which case we want to check for that. So I'm going to drag off my current button and type is valid. And I want the one with the question mark. Both will work, but this one's easier in this case, in my opinion. And only if it's not valid, meaning no button was found at the current spot, we then want to check to see if there's a slider to focus. So we can call it determine slider to focus. Now really you should check for validity here. I actually am not doing it in this case, but checking for it is a good idea. So let's go ahead and add this in real quick. Make sure our slider is valid as well, because our slider could be invalid because we didn't actually return anything. So that is important to note. And if it is valid though, we want to call our move slider function. And when we call move slider, we can pass in the current slider output parameter that we got from determine slider to focus as the slider reference. But the direction will need to come from the direction passed into the move selection function. So now we can clean this up a little bit since we know exactly what we're doing with it. So let me move this down. And these are a little bit crisscrossed, but that's okay. We can see that the true goes here and the false goes here. If you'd like at this point to play a sound effect when you move the slider, you could also just drag the move slider into this branch here. And if you are playing a sound effect upon movement, then you will automatically play that same sound effect here. So that's up to you. We'll add a different sound effect to play for sliders. We have one more episode planned for sliders currently, and we'll upgrade them quite a bit. So I'm not going to worry about that right now, but feel free to make that adjustment if you'd like. Now, after you do all that, you are good to go. You can go into your game, go into your settings menu, and you should be able to adjust your sliders freely at that point. You will have to press the button every time instead of holding it. That is another thing that we are going to cover in the next episode of sliders. But the slider does work, and it will actually set these values to what you'd expect. Alright guys, and that's what I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode or it helped you make sliders that you were able to control with your keyboard or gamepad, please subscribe. It does more for myself in the series than anything else, and it is completely free. I want to give another thank you to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. You guys are great, and I'm so incredibly grateful to have you as members of the community. And to the whole community, thank you so much for all the love and all the support, and I hope you are enjoying the series. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help you out, and that is completely free. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.